Hello Year 11 and welcome to Lesson 2 of Unit 2.5 Response and Regulation. In the first lesson of this unit we started looking at the nervous system and how that helps you to respond to any changes. First thing we're going to do today is a little starter activity just to remind ourselves of some of the key terms that we learnt about last time. So what I'd like you to do is to find a bit of blank space in your booklet. We're only going to be writing the answers down, so you don't need much room, whether it's on the back of your booklet or the side of one of your pages. So on the screen there you can see 4 sentences describing some new terms that we looked at last time. So just jot down the answers, you don't need to write down the questions, just jot down your 4 answers and then we'll have a look at them. So pause the video, write your answers down and then we'll have a look at what you should have. Okay, so if we have a look at number 1, a muscle or gland that causes a response would be referred to as an effector. Cells in sense organs that detect stimuli would be receptors. The third one, a nerve cell that carries messages within the central nervous system, that would be a relay neuron, which is going to be important for this lesson. And then number 4, a gap between the end of one neuron and the start of the next is referred to as a synapse. If you remember back to last lesson, we said that across the synapse, the electrical impulse can't be transferred. So instead, a chemical is released from the end of one nerve cell and that passes across the synapse and starts the impulse in the next one. So our objectives for today's lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to have a look at a particular response which occurs within the nervous system, which we would refer to as a reflex action. So by the end of the lesson, you should be able to name the properties of a reflex action and why they're important, and also be able to sequence the stages of a reflex arc. If you look at the syllabus in the front of your booklet, this is covering points C and D. Obviously D there is in bold, so it is for higher tier only, but for foundation tier you do need to know what reflex actions are and why they are important. So we're going to remind ourselves firstly about what happens in the nervous system and then have a look at reflex actions in particular. So on the screen there we've got a couple of examples of reflex actions. So one reflex action would be what would happen in your body if a torch was directed into your eye. So think about what would your eye do in response to that strong light. And then the second one, we've got a knee there and a what we call a patella hammer. If you strike the leg just beneath the kneecap or the patella, you will get what we call the knee-jerk response. So think about these responses. The pupil getting smaller, the knee-jerk response. Are you controlling these responses? And why do we have these responses? This is what we're going to be thinking about now. So just to remind you from last lesson, a stimulus is a change in the environment. So in this example, the stimulus is the light. Receptor cells then in the back of the eye will detect that light and then cause a response to happen. So information from the receptors, as we mentioned last lesson, is sent to the central nervous system so that the brain can coordinate the response. Now, your responses to a stimulus can either be voluntary, okay, so think about what the word voluntary means, okay, you're choosing to do them, or they can be involuntary. And what we're going to be having a look at today is an involuntary response. So a reflex action is an involuntary response. You are not in control of that response. Your body will carry that response out without any input from the brain. So the reason you have these reflexes is to allow you to respond very quickly to a situation where your body may be in danger of harm. So because it's a situation where there is a danger, you need those responses to happen very, very quickly. So therefore, the brain doesn't need to be involved. The time it takes for the brain to process the information is removed. So instead of the brain coordinating the response, the actions, the reflex actions, they're still coordinated by the central nervous system, but they would be coordinated by your spinal cord instead. So the information is sent to the spinal cord and not to the brain. So there are three main features to a reflex action that you need to be aware of. The first one is that they are very fast. Obviously, they need to be fast because they are protecting you. They happen without you thinking about it. So they're involuntary responses and they are protective. So a reflex action is very fast, it's involuntary, you're not deciding to do it, and it is a protective mechanism. So if we now turn to page 7 in the booklets, where you have that information that I've just gone through, can you please put the date at the top of the page? And I'd like you to pause the video and just highlight the key points on page 7 up to where you've got those bullet points with the 3 features. The next thing you've got in your book is some lines for you to give some examples of reflex actions. So we've got a few of these here on the screen. As we mentioned earlier, you've got your knee-jerk reflex. So this one would be if you strike just underneath your kneecap with, use either a ruler or the side of your hand to just strike the leg just underneath the kneecap. You can have a go at this at home. If you sit somewhere and cross your legs, so sit on a chair with your legs crossed, and then on your top leg, use the side of your hand or a ruler to just hit your leg just underneath the kneecap. You should feel your knee jerk up in response. Obviously, you're not making that happen. It's happening involuntarily. So the next one we have there on the screen is what happens in your eye. In a bright light, the muscles in your eye will cause the pupil to contract or get smaller to protect your eye. In dim light, the opposite will happen. The pupil will get much bigger, and that will allow more light then into the eye to protect you in a dark environment, allowing you to maximize what you can see. Okay, so this is called the pupil size reflex or the pupillary reflex. A couple of other examples would be blinking. So if something's coming towards your face, you will blink. And we've also got something called the withdrawal reflex. So I'll write this one down. So the withdrawal reflex would be when you would maybe touch something that's hot or something that causes you pain. Maybe you stand on a plug or a piece of Lego, something like that. Your body will respond by moving your body very quickly away from that source of heat or that source of pain. So that's a withdrawal reflex. Got a few examples here on the screen as well. When you're born, you actually are born with a number of other reflexes which you will then grow out of as you get bigger. So for example, the grasp reflex, if you put your finger in a newborn baby's hand, they will grip on tightly. Okay, it's protective. It would allow them to stay with that person who's protecting them and looking after them. They've also got what we call the startle reflex. If you put a newborn baby down on its back, they often will startle and their legs and arms will jerk upwards, again looking for someone to pick them up and look after them. They've also got a suckling reflex, so that will allow them to, it's called rooting, where they're looking, trying to find the nipples so that they can eat. And if you stroke a newborn baby's cheek, they'll turn their head towards your hand. okay, looking for milk. So we've looked at some examples of reflex actions. Now we need to consider how reflex actions actually happen. At the bottom of page 7, you've got a flowchart there, very similar to the one that we looked at last lesson, but more directly related to what happens in a reflex action. So the first step of a reflex action, the information is picked up from the receptor by a sensory neuron, which will carry the information then to the spinal cord. So it's taking the information, the impulse from the receptor to the spinal cord. In our examples last lesson, the middle box just said that the central nervous system coordinates the response. This is now more specific in the fact that in a reflex action, it is a relay neuron within the spinal cord. So the relay neuron picks up the information from the sensory neuron and then takes it through the spinal cord to the motor neuron, which will then take the information to the effector. Okay, so as we said last lesson, an effector would be a muscle or a gland. In most of the examples we've looked at here, the effector would be a muscle. So in the knee-jerk response, it would be the muscle in your leg. In the pupillary reflex, it will be muscles within the eye that are causing the response to happen. So we're now just going to have a look at a couple of videos which will give you a little bit more detail about reflex actions and start to think about where these neurons are traveling.
Processed at the In a reflex arc, sensory information is processed at the level of the spinal cord, resulting in action without involvement of the brain. For example, if one's fingers are burned by a candle, the hand that receives the painful stimulus is rapidly removed from the flame with a jerking motion. At the same time, the brain is receiving information indicating that a painful event occurred in the hand. It is important to understand that although the brain may perceive the painful stimulus, the reflex arc acts to retract the hand without direct input from the brain.
So if we look at the video, the picture, you can see there in a little bit more detail. So in this response, you would have the stimulus would be heat coming from the candle. That would be picked up by receptors in the skin. The information then is passed along this yellow neuron here. So this would be our sensory neuron, taking the information to the spinal cord. So this part of the diagram here is the spinal cord in cross section. So you'd be looking at if somebody had been cut in half horizontally. So you'd be able to look at the spinal cord. At the end of the sensory neuron then, you've got a synapse, and then the information passes to the green one, which is the relay neuron. At the end of the relay neuron, you have a second synapse. The information then passes to the motor neuron, so this is the blue one, which will pass the information along to the muscle here, which would be the effector, moving the hand away from the flame. Okay, so we're going to look now at a second video, which just gives a little bit more information on the knee-jerk reflex action.
There are some actions that you perform without even thinking. These are called reflex actions. A well-known reflex action is the knee jerk. Hit the knee in a particular spot and you can't help lifting your lower leg. So what's actually happening? First, stretch sensors in the muscle detect a sudden change. A nervous impulse travels along a nerve to the spinal cord. It passes through the spine, back down the leg, and causes the muscle to contract. Electrodes on the thigh pick up any electrical activity. Scientists use the trace on the oscilloscope to work out the speed of the response. It takes just 1/30th of a second. The pathway taken by a nervous impulse during a reflex action is called a reflex arc. The impulse travels in an arc through the spinal cord. It bypasses the brain, which means you don't even think about it. Reflex actions happen so quickly because they travel by the shortest route.
Okay, so if you can now turn to the next page in your booklet, so this is page 8, again, put today's date at the top. We are now going to have a look at filling in your diagram on this page to show what is happening during a reflex action or a reflex arc. So as you can see down at the bottom, we're going to add labels onto the diagram to show the stages of a reflex arc. And we're also going to draw in the 3 neurons, but you're going to need a red, a blue and a green pen to be able to do this. So if you haven't got those, can you go and get those now, please? Okay, so when we're thinking about a reflex arc, you need to be able to sequence the stages. Okay, so thinking about what is happening at each stage. So our first stage, when we're writing about a reflex arc, would always be to identify the stimulus. So that would be what causes the response. So if we add this label on first, so number 1, harmful stimulus from a hot object. So in this situation, someone's put their finger on something hot. That stimulus, so stimulus would be number 1. Number 2 then would be receptors. Okay, so in this case, pain receptors in the finger are stimulated. The response then to this stimulus would be a rapid conduction, so very fast impulses through the reflex arc. Okay, so the reflex arc is the sequence of neurons that this information would then be passed through. So on the screen, all 3 neurons are going to come up at the same time, but obviously we need to draw these one at a time in our different colours. So if we start with the sensory neuron, you're asked to draw this in red. Okay, so you need to draw the sensory neuron coming from the hand into the spinal cord to here. You can see at the end of the sensory neuron you've got this little triangle shape, which would be a synapse. So you've asked to do that in red. So draw the sensory neuron in red, and we're going to label that here. So sensory neuron. And then we're also going to label here that there is a synapse at the end of the sensory neuron. I'd also like you to draw a couple of little arrows onto the sensory neuron just to show which direction the impulse is travelling. We're also going to label that this structure is the spinal cord. So at the end of the sensory neuron then, the information is passed to the relay neuron. Now it's asking you to draw the relay neuron in blue, so I'm going to label that in blue. So this is the relay neuron here in the center of the spinal cord. So if you can draw that in. And again, at the end of the relay neuron, we have another synapse. From the relay neuron then, the information is sent to the motor neuron, which you're asked to do in green. So if you draw this neuron in green, and again we'll put a couple of arrows on there to show which direction the impulse is travelling, and this then is the motor neuron. At the end of the motor neuron then you would have the effector, which in this situation would be the muscles in the arm, which would then cause a response by moving the hand away. So it's this sequence that's really important for you to know when you're talking about a reflex arc. So the sequence is stimulus, receptors, sensory neuron, synapse, relay neuron, synapse. Don't need technically to sort of include the synapses, but it's important that you know that they're there. Then information to the motor neuron, to the effector, and then a response. So stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, effector, response. We will do some practice, lots of practice questions on sequencing these stages of a reflex arc. So pause the video now if you need to, and make sure that your diagram on page 8 matches what is there on the board. Okay, so just to go through those stages again, so we've got another diagram here of a reflex arc, just obviously set out slightly differently. So number 1, stimulus picked up by receptor cells in the finger. You can see you've got this little blue dot showing you where that's happening. Number 2 would be in green, impulse passed on to the sensory neuron. Number 3, sensory neuron passes the impulse to the spinal cord. Number 4, the spinal cord sorts out the response and sends the message to the motor neuron. And then finally, number 5, the motor neuron tells the finger to pull away by stimulating the muscle. Okay, little activity now for you to do. If you can turn to page 9, we've got the diagram at the top of the page where you need to label the diagram using the words shown, and then I'd like you to try and fill in the gaps in the paragraph using the words at the bottom. So pause the video, fill in page 9, and then we'll go through the answers. Okay, so if we have a look then at these answers, so I'm going to put the labels on in the order that they would happen. Again, we need to try and embed this sequence into your memory. So we'll start with pain receptor, so this would be here. Okay, so the pain receptor would be detecting the stimulus. The information then would pass along. This would be your sensory neuron. So again, you can see those little arrows which are showing you the direction that the impulse is traveling. The next label then would be synapse. So that would be this little triangle here. And let's put this label at the top. And then from the synapse, over the synapse, it goes into this, which would be your relay neuron. From the relay neuron then to the motor neuron, which would be this one, or you could have, well, anywhere along here could be labelled as motor neuron. And then finally at the bottom we have the effector or muscle. The last label then, which you need to add to the diagram, would be spinal column. So anywhere on this part of the diagram is the spinal column. With the paragraph then, the nerves involved in a reflex action form a reflex arc. This is made up of different types of neuron, each one separated by a tiny gap called a synapse. In the diagram above, the stimulus is a pinprick. It is detected by a pain receptor in the skin. This causes impulses to pass along the sensory neuron to the CNS. In the CNS, impulses are passed, that should be passed, not passes, from sensory neurons to motor neurons via relay neurons. Motor neurons then transmit impulses to an effector, which carries out a response. In this case, a muscle contracts and the finger is pulled away. So if you can make sure that you've got all those answers down correctly now on page 9, pause the video if you need to. Then I'd like you to turn over to page 10 and again have a go at these two activities. So for the first one, you are identifying parts A to E in the diagram of the reflex arc, and then in the second activity you need to write your own reflex arc for the leg. Again, pause the video and try and fill in that information, please. Okay, so if we look at the answers for this reflex arc first of all, so A would be the receptor, B would be the sensory neuron, C would be the relay neuron, D is the motor neuron, and E is the effector. So you were then asked to write your own reflex arc for the leg. So what you should have is something similar to this. So number 1, stimulus is picked up by receptor cells in the leg. So those would be in the skin as the sense organ. Number 2, the impulse is passed on to the sensory neuron. Number 3, sensory neuron passes the impulse to the spinal cord. Really for number 3, we should be saying that it's the relay neuron in the spinal cord that it's passed to. Number 4, the spinal cord sorts out the response and sends message to the motor neuron. And then the motor neuron tells the leg to move by causing muscle contraction. Okay, so as long as you've got something similar to what we've got there on the screen. Okay, so if you need to pause the video to get this information down, please do. So just to finish off today's lesson, just a little activity for you to have a go at. Okay, you don't really need to write these down, just reminding ourselves of these keywords to do with the nervous system. So these have had the vowels removed. Can you guess what the keywords are? Just notice that the second one doesn't seem to have all the vowels removed and is missing the start of the word, but you can probably still work out what it is. Okay, let's see how many you've got. So number 1, stimulus. Number 2, receptor. Number 3, CNS, be the central nervous system. Number 4, nerve. Number 5, neuron. Next one would be brain, then spinal cord, chemical, then blink. Well, they've missed the K off there as well. Next one would be eye, reflex, and effector. Now I'm going to just ask you to complete one more piece of work in time for your next lesson. So we'll go through the answers to this one at the start of the next lesson. I would like you, on page 11, you have a list of the nervous system keywords and a list of definitions. I would like you to match up the keywords with the definitions in preparation for next lesson. Thank you.